Hello, and welcome to another Understanding the Meta. This time focusing on the condition DPS Firebrand. Now, this build is super close to my heart, and I really enjoy this profession, so I'm happy to bring this one to you. Now, there is a slight caveat that I need to mention that even though this is a meta build, and it does appear on pro websites as a decent damage spec against small hitboxes, would you like to know more? Um, it's not technically recommended for any of the bosses. So most of the pros feel that there are better options in slot, in the DPS slot, for most of the bosses. However, I feel that it's quite underrated. I feel that there's very good options, and the flexibility coming with the class, even if you build full damage, is really good. So I just wanted to put that out there just so that people understand that while this is meta, it's not like the meta of the meta, so to speak. So, bear that in mind. But with that said, let's jump right in. So, if you're not familiar with this series, what I like to do now is I like to jump straight into the specializations and categorize the traits in one of three archetypes. And I'm just going to briefly mention them now for people who are new here. The first one is passive modifiers. So, these are modifiers like you gain 5% damage against foes that are bleeding. And since bleeding is pretty much always going to be on the target in a meta group, this is essentially just a 5% modifier. Then we have active modifiers. These are things like when you dodge, you gain 5% damage for a few seconds, meaning you have to actively dodge and then make use of that damage multiplier in that time. And then we have utility traits. These are things like when you dodge, you blind the enemy or something like that. Something that doesn't actually affect your damage and is more for a utility. And, the pro builds, they tend to really focus on the passive and active modifiers for making the most out of damage builds. So here we go, let's jump into it. So in Radiance, what passive modifiers do we have? Well, we have right hand strength, critical hit chance with one hand weapon is increased. Sword skills gain reduced recharge. We're not using swords here, we're using axes and scepter torch, but we are constantly in one handed weapons, so this is just a passive increased critical hit chance, which you'll have all the time. And then our other passive modifiers are Radiant Power. Attacks against burning foes have an increased chance to critically hit. You might be thinking that's active because you have to burn them first, but the enemy will always be burning when you're playing this build, so this is just more critical hit chance, which, really ties nicely in here, so you get an extra 25 bonus total. And then Amplified Wrath. Burning you inflict deals increased damage, burn enemies when you block their attacks. So, whilst there are active ways to block and potentially proc this more often than that, it's not effective in a damage setting. So we're looking at this as just sort of a passive modifier to increase the damage your burning does in general. So for utility traits, we just have one, and it's this trait right here. Justice is blind, gain a light aura, and blind nearby foes when you activate Virtue of Justice. So we're blinding someone, doesn't really increase the damage any, so this is just a nice utility trait to blind. Not really that useful in general. And then we have active modifiers. And for our active modifiers, we have Virtue of Justice is renewed when you kill the foe. This means if you kill a trash mob in any sort of boss, your Virtue of Justice, which in this case is a Tome of Justice, will be renewed. And this will become very important later on. And it's actually why I feel this build is quite underrated in a lot of areas, because people don't make use of this as much as they possibly can. Anyway, moving on to the next active modifier, we've got Radiant Fire. Gain Zealot's Flame when you critically hit an enemy. Burning you inflict has increased duration, and your torch skills gain reduced recharge. So, what does this do essentially? Well, Zealot's Flame is a torch skill. It's this torch 4 skill here. And actually, when you gain it, it gives you a second ability, which is to throw your Zealot's Flame to damage targeted foes. This does a lot of damage, and you'll be spamming this constantly during the fight. And this will actually change the skill on your bar. So this is something you have to look out for, and you'll see that when we go into the rotation a little bit later on. See that in action. You see that this comes up more frequently than just the cooldown of the actual skill on your bar. So that's the Radiance. So onto virtues, and we have 2 passive modifiers here. Power of the Virtuous, deal increased damage for each boon on you. Virtues gain reduced recharge. So that's a nice recharge reduction, and since you won't be in charge of putting boons on yourself, because it's not beneficial to just pump boons on yourself to increase your own damage, this is a passive modifier. And then we have Permeating Wrath. Virtue of Justice's passive triggers more quickly and now burns in an area. So this just makes your Virtue of Justice passive a little bit stronger, and it'll trigger more often. So that's just a nice passive damage boost. And then we have utility traits. We have Inspired Virtue. Virtues apply boons to allies when activated. Since it's really up to somebody else to apply the might to your group, I'm not going to classify this as an active multiplier because giving 3 might out is basically nothing for 5 seconds. So that's a utility trait. Then we have Virtue of Retribution. Gain retaliation when you activate a virtue. Retaliation you grant has increased duration. So giving this is nice to your team, but generally speaking, it's not going to be an enormous boost in damage, so it's not going to be beneficial to pump your virtues when it's not, good for other reasons. And then we have Virtuous Solace, cast Merciful Sanctuary when you're struck below the threshold. So nice little heal when you're struck below 25%. Very good example of a utility trait. And then we have 1 active modifier, and that's this one here, Unscathed Contender. Deal increased damage while you have Aegis. So Aegis will be put on you periodically, and if you get hit, this will go off. So important to think about whether you can keep Aegis up to keep this damage bonus, this enormous damage bonus up. And if you can't, Master of Consecrations would be an option to increase the damage you get from this skill here, Purging Flames. So that's virtues. And then in Firebrand, we are stacked with passive modifiers. So Unrelenting Criticism. Axe skills gain a chance to inflict bleeding, and Symbol of Vengeance now dazes on its initial strike. So axe skills, extra bleed, passive damage because we're using the axe. And then the daze is nice when you need to CC. You just need to remember that the Symbol of Vengeance can now actually do a little bit of daze as well. And then we have Legendary Lore Tome. This skill gains bonuses from scribbling in the margins by Ancient Bards. So your tomes, your F1 tome, for example, these all have added burning on them. This is what makes it a passive damage modifier. And then we have gain increase attributes while affected by quickness. So if your Mesmer is doing his job right, then you should, or his or her job right, I should say, then you should have quickness up on you most of the time, which means these are just sort of passive stats which will affect your damage, healing power, and toughness. The damage is obviously the one that we really care about. That 250 conde damage is going to make a huge difference. And then we have Lawmaster. Tome skills gain reduced recharge. So this means you can use your damaging skills more frequently, but more importantly, retain virtues passives when they're on cooldown. So if you remember earlier, we picked this trait, Virtue of Justice. Passive triggers more quickly and now burns in an area. The combination of these 2 traits, Lawmaster and Permeating Wrath, means that we can use our F1 skill as much as we like, which is important because these are high damaging abilities, and we'll get to that when we start looking into the rotation. So I'd like to collate all of that information into some salient points to look out for when you're playing this build. Firstly, we're going to look at Radiant Fire. Gain Zealot's Flame when you critically hit an enemy. Burning you inflict has increased duration. So it's that Zealot's Flame that I was talking about earlier. When this happens, you need to press it. So it will be on for 3 seconds, and it will happen randomly, as in every 10 seconds. It's not really random, but you get my drift. It's not an active process to set it off. So you'll be pressing this, and then at some point during this cooldown, the actual trait trigger will happen as well. So just keep an eye out for the Radiant Fire proc. Secondly, Unscathed Contender. Like, if you can keep up Aegis when you're playing this fight, then run this. Otherwise, run Master of Concentrations. And thirdly, pay attention to the renewed justice. The virtue of justice is renewed when you kill a foe. If this procs, you want to be aware of it, because that allows you to use your Tome of Justice again and start that part of the rotation second time, which will significantly up your damage. And a little bonus salient point is be nice to your Mesmer. Because imbued haste, the more quickness you get, it's going to really affect your damage with that plus 250 condition damage boost there. So those are the salient points to think about when you're playing this build. So I'm going to have a look at the skills now. We're not going to talk about how much of a Swiss Army specialization this actually is at the moment, but we're just going to focus on the damage stuff, which, if you hadn't guessed, is mostly about burning. So what do we have? We have the Mantra of Flame, burn, Purging Flames, burn, Signet of Wrath, increasing your condition damage so that these things can burn more. And then we have Renewed Focus. So this is what renews the tomes on the F1 and 2 and 3, or virtues if you're playing the basic Guardian. But in this case, it renews the tomes. And we've got this because the tome is super powerful. And we'll get into that in a sec. But I just wanted to look at the weapons for the time being. So we have Scepter Torch and Axe Torch. Axe is a reasonable Condi weapon, but you see like there's some bleed there, and we're focusing heavily on burn, so the Torch is important. Zealot's Flame does a lot of damage. This doesn't do enough to make it worth using, so it's mostly using Zealot's Flame and obviously Blazing Edge there for a bit more burning, and then some bleeding here as well. The confusing thing to some people might be, well, you know, why have you got the Scepter then? This is clearly a damage, a direct damage, a power damage weapon, so to speak. And we'll get into that in a bit, but essentially, like, this relies on continuing to attack to do your damage. This is something you can put out, and it will pulse, which means when you use the tomes, or you use Renewed Justice, you have... So this is still pulsing while we're in the tome. So it's a way of like making damage, the constant damage of the scepter be more effective while you're doing something else. And these tomes are super powerful. I mean, this one in particular, there's so much damage on this kit. So if you look here, you know, the 3 is the only one that doesn't have any sort of burn on it. Everything else, heavy burn. And we'll get into which skills of those to use later on. But so that's the justification for that. Also worth mentioning that Mantra Flame is an instant class, so you can cast it while you're casting other stuff, which means you just need to keep this from going to 0. And so you just keep pressing it, and as you see, like, it recharges there. You see that square going around the icon. And you just keep it on 1. If it goes to 0, then it goes on the full cooldown, which you don't want to do. So that's like a brief look at the skills. And then for the heal, it really is sort of dealer's choice. A lot of people go for the mantra. I kind of like the Signet of Resolve. You might want to go for Shelter if you have something that you want to block a lot, because there is this trait here, burning enemies when you block their attacks. So, there is some synergy there. So, but as I said, it's kind of dealer's choice what heal you want to go for. So that's the skills. So now we're going to dive into the rotation. First of all, we're just going to watch a pro. I got this footage from the Snowcrow's website. We're going to watch him do it first of all, and then we're going to slow it right down and examine exactly what he's doing and why he's doing it. So let's watch it. So now you've seen the rotation, we're going to really slow it down and examine exactly why he is doing what he is doing. So the first thing that's worth mentioning is he has some Mesmer clones with him. That's so he can proc the burning off of Ashes of the Just, which is a trait and also the number 5 skill inside the Tome of Justice. So with that in mind, he's going to start in Axe Torch, and we're just going to go straight into it. We're going to start with Axe 2, whilst using Mantra Flame, Purging Flames, and he's going to triple press, if you see, Torch 4. And then go straight into the Scepter, use Scepter 2, and then start with the Tome combo, as I previously mentioned. 2, 5, 4, 1, 2. That 2, 5, 4, 1, 2 combo. Come back out into the Scepter. Now he's going to use Renewed Focus, because the Tome is so strong that you can stop casting for 3 whole seconds, and it still makes it worth it. By this point, the Zealot's Flame proc is up again, and he can get going, hit a Scepter 2, and go straight back into the Tome again. So at this point, he's just doing the same Tome rotation he did before, and coming back in, pressing Scepter 2, and then swapping to the Axe. And then at this point, he's just going to loiter in the Axe, using skills on cooldown. Just basically making sure he's doing all his damage abilities. Also making sure Mantra of Flame stays on 2 stacks. Or stays less than 2 stacks, I should say. Until his Tome of Justice is back up again. And then he swaps back to the Scepter. And then into the Tome combo again. So I have 2 side-by-side recordings here of me basically doing the same rotation, and it's to demonstrate that there's something a bit janky about the large hitbox, and it is something to do with positioning, but I can't work it out. But you should be able to tell fairly quickly how fairly similar these rotations are from me. And the one on the left gets 28.5k, and the one on the right gets 23.5, and that's not a small difference either. That's a really big difference. So let's now have a look at what you can do for CC on this profession. And you need to be a little bit careful about this, because when you CC, either sometimes you don't have access to what you need, or you flatly have used it for actual damage. So just be a little bit aware of that when you're playing this profession. In particular with regards to axe skills, Symbol of Vengeance does a 1 second daze, and there's a 600 pull on that, so that does a little bit of CC. If you're swapped out of axe, obviously you're not going to have access to those 2 skills, so if you can time your abilities with that, that's important. If you do get stuck in the Tome 3 skill is a pull. It's not a particularly strong pull, but it will do some CC. And also there is a taunt in the F3 ability as well. So you have the ability to pull that out if you want to get that 1.5 second taunt there. Worst comes to the worst, you can also use the Signet, although you really, really don't want to do that if you can at all avoid it, so you can keep getting that 180 Condi damage. And then there is a 3 second immobilize here, which, to be fair, should be enough so that the crossover between that and that shouldn't be an issue anyway. So 2 and 3 on Axe. If you absolutely positively need it, we have the F1 3 skill, which is a pull, and then the F3 skill, which is now on cooldown, so I can't show you, but it's the number 2 skill in the Tome of Courage, which is also a pull. So that's the CC on this profession. Now, I do want to take a moment to actually talk about just how versatile this class is in general. Like, we've spoken about how good it is, in terms of damage and the combination of having allies, and the fact that this Tome of Justice getting renewed in certain points just gives you a lot more damage. So now let's talk about the Swiss Army part of this this profession. I'm going to start in the Tome of Courage, actually. So we mentioned before there's a taunt here. All of the skills here are super useful in certain circumstances. So let's have a look at them. Well, we've got Unflicting Charge. This is stability, and it will give this to your allies. So if you know for certain that your team needs stability, that is something. All of these skills, by the way, will give protection because of a trait, because of this trait here. So you're giving out protection no matter what you do here. This is something I do want to draw people's attention to, is if your team's getting super messed up at any given time, this could mean the difference between life and death. So if it doesn't take long to switch into a tome, use a couple abilities and switch out. You probably don't even have to drop that much DPS, but this will give you your team this particular thing, which enhances toughness, which could potentially save your team in a pinch. And also this could potentially save your team in a pinch, which is what for when times you know that your team's going to take a lot of condition damage, like a lot of condies are killing people. Pump this, it will pulse resistance to everyone in the area, and of course give the protection as well. And here we have something which, in my mind, is stupidly strong. And if you look at this, it's reflection, and it's 5 seconds of reflection every 5.25 seconds. Now, admittedly, you only have a certain number of charges of this, but in certain circumstances, being able to reflect. Okay, so we're reflecting for 5 seconds. You see, this will last basically until the cooldown of this, and then we can cast it again. So, like in certain circumstances, you could have almost permanent reflection from just that skill for for as many charges as you have on the tome. So that's the Tome of Courage. I do want to quickly mention the Tome of Resolve as well, which you shouldn't, in theory, have to use. But again, I wanted to mention the flexibility of this, because the healing on these skills is really strong without any stats dedicated. As you know, we're a full damage build. Without any stats dedicated, we're getting a lot of healing out of this. So I'm going to draw people's attention to this first of all. Epilogue Tome, purify your allies with waters and increase the healing they receive. So when you go into the tome in order to help your allies, pop this one first. It removes conditions, which is just generally helpful, and it gives this buff which improves the healing they receive with the rest of your skills for that time. And then this is a very nice skill, and you pop this on. It's almost 400 healing per pulse. There's 5 pulses, so that's like 2,000 heal. But then add the 33% onto that, and we've rounded up a bit, so we'll round down again. It's about 2,500 total. And then you get a nice little auto attack with heals as well here, which does a fair amount. And there's even more condition removal if your team is really suffering from conditions. Because as I said, there's big condition removal here anyway, so you probably won't have to use that as well. But pop 5, pop 4, maybe spam a couple of 1s while you still have charges in your tome, and you can act as a de facto emergency healer if your team needs it. And now ultimately, this is probably not a good idea in general. Continuing your damage rotation is what you're there to do, so it's just something worth mentioning, is just how strong this is without any stats. So that's that. So yeah, all in all, that's basically what I wanted to go through for the Firebrand. I really enjoy this specialization. I think it's really underrated in raids, and I think its ability to use the F2 and the F3 to pull people out of bad situation is quite underrated as well. And ultimately, it's not supposed to be required, but I like having it, and I enjoy the actual rotation of the damage as well. So. All that's left to say is thanks for watching, and tell a friend.